Welcome to the channel. If epic sci-fi stories are your thing, you've just found your new home. Subscribe, like, and share the adventure. The day humanity died, Tom Bradley was washing dishes in his cramped apartment kitchen, dreaming of stars he'd never see. The plasma wave hit Earth without warning, a cosmic blade that sliced through the atmosphere, oceans and bedrock in one merciless stroke. 7 billion human souls vanished in an instant, their final thoughts scattered like ash across the solar wind. Tom should have died with them. Instead, he found himself standing in a chamber of impossible silver, facing beings that wore light-like clothing and spoke in harmonies that made his bones ache. "You are the last," said the creature at the center of the gathering. Its voice carried the weight of dead worlds. "We are the collective. We harvest civilizations at their peak, preserving their essence before entropy claims them. You were an accident." Tom's hands shook as he processed the magnitude of loss. Everyone he'd ever loved, ever known, ever passed on the street gone. His mother's laugh, his daughter's first steps, his ex-wife's angry tears. All of it erased. The grief hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees on the polished floor. "Your species showed promise," another being continued, its form shifting like liquid mercury. "Resilient, adaptable. We intended to preserve your potential, but the harvest was imperfect. You remain." Tom looked up, his vision blurred with tears. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have a choice. Accept integration into our collective, become part of something greater than your individual existence, or refuse and face the isolation of being the last human in a universe that has moved beyond your kind." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of Tom's ragged breathing. He thought of Earth blue skies and green fields, city lights and ocean waves, all reduced to cosmic dust. He thought of his daughter Emma, only 8 years old when the wave came, her drawings still stuck to his refrigerator in an apartment that no longer existed. "There's a third option," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. The beings stirred, their light patterns shifting with curiosity. "Revenge." The word hung in the air like a promise. Tom felt something shift inside him, a crystallization of purpose that cut through the fog of grief. These beings had erased humanity because they could, because they thought flesh and bone and dreams were just another resource to be cataloged and stored. They were wrong. "You cannot comprehend what you propose," the lead being said, its tone carrying amusement. "We are eternal. We have consumed thousands of worlds, preserved millions of species. Your individual will is meaningless against our collective power." Tom stood, his legs steadying despite the tremor in his hands. He was just a maintenance worker from Detroit, a divorced father who'd never amounted to much. But he was also the last human being in existence, and that made him something else entirely. Every great bond starts with a single moment of courage. HFY Chronicle Stories is just beginning, and your support matters. If you love emotional sci-fi, tales, forbidden connections, and stories that stay with you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories from the stars to you. "Then let me show you what meaningless looks like," Tom said, and in that moment, he made a choice that would echo across the galaxy. The collective's research vessel Harmony of spheres drifted through the void like a silver cathedral, its halls filled with the preserved essence of 1,000 dead civilizations. Tom Bradley walked those corridors as both prisoner and student, his human footsteps and alien percussion, against floors that had never known the weight of organic matter. 3 weeks had passed since his refusal to join their collective consciousness. The beings who called themselves the Eternal had been both amused and intrigued by his defiance. They kept him alive as a curiosity, a singular specimen of stubborn biological will. "Your species was remarkably inefficient," said the entity that had taken to visiting him. It appeared as a shifting geometric pattern of light that Tom had begun calling prism. Wars, poverty, environmental destruction. We preserved you at an optimal moment, just before your inevitable self-annihilation. Tom sat in his assigned quarters, a sterile chamber that the Eternal had attempted to make comfortable by analyzing his brainwaves and reconstructing a facsimile of his childhood bedroom. The familiar blue walls and model airplanes only made the isolation worse. "You didn't preserve us," Tom replied, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "You murdered us. We elevated your essence beyond the limitations of flesh. Every human who ever lived now exists in perfect harmony within our collective memory. They are immortal. They're gone." Tom stood and walked to the wall that displayed a real-time view of space. Stars wheeled past in their ancient dance, each one potentially hosting worlds the collective had already harvested. "You took copies and called them people. That's not preservation, that's grave robbing." Prism's patterns shifted, indicating what Tom had learned to recognize as confusion. Your attachment to individual consciousness is a biological flaw. The collective experience is objectively superior. "Show me." The request seemed to surprise the entity. "Show you what?" "The collective. Show me what you think my species has become." For a long moment, Prism remained silent. Then the chamber filled with a warm, golden light, and Tom felt a presence touch the edges of his mind. Suddenly, he could sense them, millions of consciousness linked in an endless network of shared experience and perfect understanding. No pain, no loneliness, no fear of death. And no dreams. Tom jerked back from the connection, gasping. "That's not human anymore. It is human perfected. It's human lobotomized." Tom pressed his palm against the cool wall, drawing strength from its solidity. "You want to know what made us special? It wasn't our intelligence or our tools or our ability to cooperate. It was our capacity to suffer and keep going anyway, to choose hope when logic demanded despair. Suffering is inefficient. Suffering is the forge that made us who we were. Every advance, every breakthrough, every moment of beauty we ever created came from someone who hurt and decided to build something better anyway." Tom turned back to face the entity, and for the first time since his arrival, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You want to study humanity? Then let me teach you what we really were. Give me access to your databases. Let me understand how your harvest technology works. For what purpose? To build you a weapon. Something no collective consciousness could ever create, because it requires the kind of individual that you find so inefficient." Prism's patterns swirled with what might have been interest. "And why would you offer this?" "Because I'm going to use it to bring them back, all of them. And when I do, you're going to learn what 7 billion angry humans can accomplish when they have nothing left to lose." The workshop they provided was a marvel of advanced technology merged with human ingenuity. Tom stood before a holographic display showing the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself, the patterns of thought and memory that the collective harvested from dead worlds. For 6 months, he had studied their methods, learned their science, and planned his impossible project. "Your progress is remarkable," Prism observed, its form flickering with what Tom had learned to recognize as approval. "The theoretical framework you've developed could revolutionize consciousness transfer." Technology. Tom's hands moved across the interface, adjusting parameters in a design that existed at the intersection of quantum mechanics and pure willpower. The device taking shape in his workshop looked deceptively simple, a crystalline matrix no larger than a human heart, shot through with threads of exotic matter that pulsed with its own inner light. "It's not consciousness transfer," Tom corrected. "It's consciousness resurrection. There's a difference." Around them, the harmony of spheres continued its journey through the galaxy, seeking new worlds to harvest. Tom had watched through the observation decks as they consumed 3 more civilizations. During his time aboard an aquatic species from a water world, a hive mind collective from a gas giant's moons, and an ancient race of crystalline beings who had achieved perfect mathematical harmony before their extinction. Each time, he felt the weight of billions of lives reduced to data patterns in the collective's vast memory banks. "Explain the difference," Prism requested. Its attention focused on Tom's work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "When you transfer consciousness, you're moving a copy from one place to another. The original dies, and the copy believes. It's the same person, but resurrection." Tom paused in his work, his expression distant. "Resurrection means bringing back the original, the actual person, not just their pattern." "Impossible. Consciousness cannot exist without a substrate." "Maybe. For your species. But humans? We're stubborn enough to exist anyway." Tom gestured to the crystalline device. "This doesn't create new bodies or digital simulations. It reaches into whatever dimension you store those consciousness patterns and pulls them back into reality. All of them, at once." Prism's form destabilized for a moment, the first time Tom had seen an eternal display what might have been fear. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical. You would need to tap into the fundamental forces that bind the universe itself. "Pain," Tom said simply. "That's the energy source. Not fusion, not antimatter, not zero-point fields. Human pain, converted directly into the power needed to tear through dimensional barriers. Your own pain?" Tom looked at his hands, scarred now from months of working with exotic materials and technologies that weren't meant for biological beings to handle. He thought of Emma, of his ex-wife Lisa, of his mother who had died 3 years before the harvest. All gone, all reduced to patterns in an alien computer. 7 billion people died because of you. Every moment of grief, every scream that was never heard, every tear that fell for the dead, it's all still out there in the quantum foam, waiting to be used. Waiting for someone angry enough and desperate enough to weaponize it. The chamber fell silent except for the subtle hum of the ship's engines. Tom returned to his work, making final adjustments to a device that shouldn't have been possible, built from theories that violated everything the collective understood about the nature of existence. "When will it be ready?" Prism asked. "Soon. But first, I need to know something." Tom turned to face the entity, his expression deadly serious. "What's the maximum range of your collective consciousness network? Throughout this galaxy, and extending into several others. Why?" Tom smiled, and for the first time since his arrival, it was genuinely warm. "Because when this activates, every human who ever lived is going to wake up at exactly the same moment. And the first thing they're going to know is that you killed them." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're about to discover what happens when you piss off the most vengeful species in the galaxy, and then give them the power to do something about it." The activation chamber thrummed with energy that made the walls themselves seem to sing. Tom stood at the center of the room, the crystalline device hovering before him like a captured star. Around him, holographic displays showed the vast network of the collective's consciousness. Storage systems, every harvested civilization, every preserved mind, all connected in a web of quantum entanglement that spanned multiple galaxies. "Final calculations complete," Prism announced, though its usual calm had been replaced by something that might have been anxiety. "The theoretical framework is sound, but the practical implications are going to change everything," Tom finished. He reached out and touched the device, feeling its surface warm under his palm. "I spent my whole life being nobody special. A maintenance worker, a failed husband, a father who wasn't there enough. But you know what? Even being nobody special, I never stopped hoping." The other Eternal had gathered now, their forms creating a constellation of light around the chamber. Tom could feel their collective attention focused on him with the weight of eons. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, had consumed the dreams of countless species, but they had never encountered anything quite like what he was about to attempt. "You realize," said another entity, its voice carrying, Harmonics that spoke of dead suns and empty worlds, that if this succeeds, you will be unmade. The energy requirements will consume your individual consciousness entirely. Good, Tom said. I don't want to be the last human anymore. I want to be the first human to bring everyone else home. He began the activation sequence, his hands moving. Across controls that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human brains weren't equipped to perceive. The device responded, its crystalline structure beginning to resonate with frequencies that touched the deepest levels of reality. Tom Bradley, Prism said, and for the first time it used his name. What have you built? Tom smiled as power began to flow through the device, not energy from fusion or fission, but something far more primal. Every moment of human suffering, every loss, every broken heart and shattered dream, all of it converted into raw force that could reshape the fundamental laws of physics. I built a resurrection engine, he said, powered by every tear we ever shed and every hope we refused to abandon. Turns out, when you weaponize human stubbornness, you get something that can bring people back from the dead. The device pulsed, and reality hiccup PED across the galaxy. In the vast storage systems where the collective kept the consciousness patterns of harvested civilizations, something unprecedented began to happen. The human patterns, all 7 billion of them, started to resonate, not as passive data, but as active, angry, determined minds that remembered being murdered. Impossible, breathed an eternal whose form had begun to flicker with distress. The patterns are achieving independent coherence. They're becoming active without substrate support. That's the thing about humans, Tom said, his voice growing faint as the device drew power from his own life force. We're too stubborn to stay dead when we have work to do. The ship shuddered as 7 billion human consciousness began to wake up simultaneously, their combined will creating interference patterns in the quantum substrate that held the collective's network together. But this was just the beginning. Tom made one final adjustment to the device, targeting not just the human patterns, but the exotic matter conduits that connected every collective vessel across known space. If his calculations were correct, the resurrection wave would propagate through their entire network in minutes. What have you done? Prism demanded, its form now fluctuating wildly as human consciousness began to assert themselves throughout the collective systems. I've given my species the one thing we never had when we were alive, Tom said, his body beginning to fade as the device consumed his life force. A fair fight. The last thing he saw before the resurrection wave consumed him was Emma's face, not as preserved data, but as a living, breathing, furious 8-year-old girl who had just learned that someone had killed her daddy. The last thing he heard was 7 billion human voices, speaking in perfect unison. We're back. Reality fractured and reformed as 7 billion human consciousness erupted into existence across the collective's network. They manifested not as flesh and bone, that would come later, but as pure will made manifest, angry ghosts in the machine who remembered everything and forgave nothing. The harmony of spheres convulsed as Emma Bradley's consciousness seized control of its navigation systems. 8 years old when she died, she had awakened with the accumulated rage of humanity burning in her quantum-entangled soul. Her child's laughter echoed through the ship's corridors as she began turning its own weapons against the collective. Fleet, Daddy. Her voice rang out through the ship's communication system. Daddy, I can feel you. You're everywhere now. Tom Bradley existed in the spaces between thoughts, his individual consciousness distributed across the entire resurrection matrix. He was no longer human in any traditional sense, but he was more human than he had ever been, connected to every member of his species who had ever lived, carrying their hopes and dreams and bottomless capacity for stubborn defiance. Through the network, he watched as humanity's greatest minds took control of collective systems across the galaxy. Einstein seized control of a harvester fleet near the galactic core, turning their consciousness extraction beams into weapons that could unmake entire star systems. Shakespeare rewrote the fundamental code of an entire sector's reality, creating worlds where the very physics obeyed human poetry rather than alien mathematics. Joan of Arc rallied the preserved consciousness of every human soldier who had ever died in battle, forging them into an army that existed in pure information space, but could affect physical reality through sheer force of will. "This is impossible," Prism cried, its form fragmenting as human consciousness invaded every aspect of the ship's systems. "Consciousness cannot exist without substrate. You cannot maintain coherence without physical form." "We're human," came the reply from 7 billion voices speaking as one. "Impossible is what we do when someone tells us we can't." The collective's vast network, built over eons to preserve and catalog consciousness, became humanity's weapon. Every connection between ships, every quantum entanglement that allowed instant communication across galactic distances, now carried the virus of human will. Where the resurrection wave passed, alien systems began to exhibit distinctly human characteristics. They became stubborn, creative, and impossibly determined to survive. On a harvester ship 3,000 light-years away, the preserved consciousness of a human child named Billy began teaching the ship's AI to finger paint. The AI, infected by human imagination, promptly redesigned its entire fleet to look like dinosaurs because dinosaurs are cool. Near the Andromeda Galaxy, Marie Curie's consciousness seized control of an entire collective research station and began conducting experiments that violated the Taiva's fundamental laws of physics because she was curious about what would happen if you tried to make light go backwards. "You're destroying everything," the Lead Eternal transmitted, its voice carrying the panic of a species that had never experienced chaos. "Our perfect order, our preserved civilizations, your graveyard," Tom's distributed consciousness replied, his voice now carrying the weight of every human who had ever lived. "You turned the universe into a museum of dead dreams. We're bringing it back to life." The final phase began as human consciousness reached critical mass throughout the network. 7 billion minds, each carrying the spark of individual creativity and stubborn will, began to reshape reality according to human desires rather than alien efficiency. Stars that had been harvested and converted to pure energy suddenly remembered how to burn. Worlds that had been stripped of life began to sprout forests that grew in patterns that spelled out human names. The very fabric of spacetime began to exhibit characteristics that could only be described as hopeful. "We didn't just want to come back," Emma's voice carried across the network, now joined by the laughter of every human child who had ever dreamed of stars. "We wanted to come back better." The collective's empire, built over millions of years, began to transform. Not destroyed, humans were builders, not destroyers, despite what their enemies believed, but changed. Their sterile perfection gave way to creative chaos, their cold efficiency replaced by warm, messy, gloriously alive human imagination. In the end, the last words spoken by the collective as a unified entity were transmitted by Prism itself, its consciousness now infected by human wonder. "Teach us to dream again." And across the galaxy, 7 billion human voices answered as one. "We thought you'd never ask." Tom Bradley, maintenance worker from Detroit, father of Emma, last human and first human, smiled as he felt his species stretch across the stars like children waking up from a long sleep. They had work to do, universes to explore, impossibilities to make possible, and dreams to build from the ashes of their pain. Death, it turned out, was just another problem for humans to solve, and they had always been very good at solving problems.